called the Pretender King, because they did not invite him to take the crown. The reason was he was also professed Catholic, and would not change his religion. If he had become Protestant, they probably would have offered him the crown. He refused to do so. So they go way back up the chart, way back off up here through a lady named Sophia to find the new king, who is King George I of Hanover. The Hanoverians are Germans. He doesn't not speak English. This is the grandfather of our King George, George III, that we fought the revolution against. So this begins an entire new dynasty. We had the Tudors, ended with Elizabeth I. We had all the Stuarts that I just talked about. Now we're switching over to the House of Hanover. And so this is the first guy to take over. As you can imagine, not everybody was happy with this arrangement. He was Protestant, which made him happy, but a lot of people did not think that was the thing for them to do. They thought they should have stuck with the Stuart line, and thus sets up the bulk of our program, which is going to talk about the Stuarts, the Old Pretender, and his folks, as they're hanging out in Europe trying to get the crown back. And there's a lot of people that are in this game with them. So back to King James II that we left a little while ago. He was run out of England. You can see in 1688, he dies in 1701, but in the meantime, he's hanging out in mainly France. He has a son that we've already talked about, James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender. And eventually the Old Pretender is going to have a son, and his name is Charles Edward Stuart, the Young Pretender, or as we know him, Bonnie Prince Charlie. So this is mainly the guys that we're going to focus this talk around. King James, who got run out of England by William of Orange, his son, who spends most of his life trying to get the crown of England back, the Old Pretender, and then his son, Bonnie Prince Charlie, who in his time also tries to get the crown back. And we're going to tie all this hopefully into Masonry. So those guys that I just talked about, all of the Stuart males, are just kind of hanging out in Europe and plotting to take over when Queen Mary II dies. And then she dies and Queen Anne takes over, as I talked about, and they didn't get their chance. But they knew that when Queen Anne died, that was their opportunity to get the crown back. It was just the logical thing to do. But when Queen Anne dies without an heir in 1714, that doesn't happen, and they go get George, as I discussed. Now, James, and especially his court, all of his people, his political body, all of his the people that are surrounding him, are hanging out in France, mainly at this place. The King of France gives them a little chateau called Saint Germain. It's on the outskirts of Paris. And this is where the bulk of the activity goes on to try to get them restored to the crown. It's kind of their central hub of influence. So while James has died in 1701, so by the time Anne dies, he's already dead, but his son, the Old Pretender here, is the one that's working the angles to try and get the crown back, and he's hanging out at Saint Germain with a whole host of folks. Let me see if I can close this out. Okay, so he has a ton of people that are working out of Saint Germain. These are 4 of them that we're going to discuss mainly because these guys all have large influence on Masonry. John Erskine, 6th Earl of Mar, when Queen Anne dies, he knows this is the opportunity, so he resigns his post in the government in England. He was in England at the time, and moves to Saint Germain. Becomes a professed Jacobite, which he kind of already was, but you know he goes all in with the Stuarts at this point. He basically is the guy that leads the first revolt. So in 1614, a year after the death of Queen Anne, Mar leads this Jacobite rebellion. Now, this is the first time I've used the word Jacobite, I think, and all it means is talking about James, Jacob being a derivation of James, King James II. All of this movement, both Masonic and political, is called Jacobitism, named after James from this point on. So in 1715, they raise a rebellion. It fails, and he is exiled back to the continent. Just to jump ahead 2 years, the next thing that happens is in 1717, there's a thing called the Swedish Jacobite plot, which is basically where it's a kind of a coup attempt with trying to get Sweden and Russia to come in on the side of the Jacobites and raise an army. It also gets discovered by British intelligence, and it fails. So in the few years after Queen Anne dies, there's lots of rebellion and plots and conspiracies, and the Grand Lodge of England is worried. Check it. The British government is worried, and so they're going to do something about it here in just a little bit. 1717 being the year as we know that the Grand Lodge was established. We'll talk about that in just a second. One of the other guys that was hanging out at St. Germain and was in the 1715 rebellion is this guy, James Radcliffe, the third Earl of Derwentwater, and he is captured, imprisoned in the Tower of London, and he is executed. He has a brother that's going to play a very important role a little bit later in our story. So after the 1715 and 1717 failures, the Earl of Mar, Erskine, returns to St. Germain, and they kind of regroup. They've tried two really bold, one invasion, one semi-invasion, and so they go back and they decide to kind of play a longer game, right? So I didn't get around to getting the quote on this, but there was a well-known, not a theory, it was well known that when Charles II was restored to the throne, there was this guy named General Monk who had changed sides, come in on the side of Charles II. He was very important in getting him restored, in that he had used Masonic lodges to his advantage, both as a safe haven, a place that they could pass information because the brothers were sworn by their oaths to secrecy, and generally to garner support. They remembered this, these guys that are now trying to get the Jacobites restored. So in 1717, just after all of this has happened, miraculously, the Grand Lodge of England is formed. Here's a few quotes. This is from Rick Berman's book, Espionage, Diplomacy, and the Lodge. With the exposure and suppression of that plot, the Swedish Jacobite plot, in January of 1717, England's Whig ministry worried about the Jacobite influence within Masonry. Thus, the Loyalist Grand Lodge was organized in June as a Hanoverian Whig countermove. So the Hanoverian government, being that of George of Hanover, they were king's men for the Hanoverians, and the Whig was a political party that was tied to them. They're almost synonymous terms. So what he's saying is that they formed the Grand Lodge because many of the other lodges, they were afraid, were infiltrated by the Jacobites. Scottish leaning members are not so much for Scotland itself, but for the Scottish heritage king, King James. So they set up this, the Grand Lodge, as a counterbalance to that. Freemasonry's medieval oaths were revised and updated to ensure that its members would swear to uphold the rule of civil law as enforced by the magistracy and the judiciary, and abide by and respect parliamentarian government and a constitutional Hanoverian monarchy. Do you wonder why in our North Carolina ritual, in the charge, we talk about being a true and peaceable, good citizen, true to your government, just to your country, not to countenance disloyalty or rebellion? Can all come back to this idea right here. In this picture that we'll come back to, this guy right here is the Duke of Wharton, which is a fascinating Masonic story in his own right. Okay. Now I'm going to skip to a couple of quotes. I hate reading from the slides, but this is pretty good stuff to set up what was going on within the lodges. This is from Dr. Marcia Keith Schuchard in her book, Manuel Swedenborg, Secret Agent on Earth and in Heaven. According to the Enlightenment historian Margaret Jacob, who she's quoting here, in Hanoverian England, Whiggery, the Whig Party, provided the belief and values, while Freemasonry provided one temple wherein some of its most devoted followers worshiped the god of Newtonian science. They're talking about Isaac Newton here, and the Royal Society. A ton of the guys that formed the Grand Lodge of England were also Royal Society members, a whole bunch of them. So they were king's men in that they were Hanoverian, they were Whig Party generally, and they were Royal Society members. And this is the whole, you know, the rise of science, modern science as we know it. So this is kind of what they were, the Grand Lodge of England and the Whigs. To contrast that, the Franco-Scottish lodges developed by the exiled supporters of the Stuarts, which drew upon the older traditions of Kabbalistic and Rosicrucian symbolism, while they utilized clandestine international networks to fraternally bind their dispersed brethren, ensure security, and maintain mystic morale. So what she's saying here is the Scottish lodges were very different. The lodges that the Stuart supporters were both harboring and creating, and they were creating them all over Europe, were to ensure security and maintain their mystic morale and fraternally bind all these brothers together, not only to each other, but also to the Jacobite cause, which is restoration. So to go back to Saint Germain, Mar is back at Saint Germain, going to play a longer game here. And one of the things that they're doing is they're running around setting up lodges kind of all over Europe for all the reasons that we just discussed. And these are Kabbalistic in nature and Rosicrucian symbolism, as we just read. There's references to one at Saint Germain. You can see the dates and the places here in Paris and Florence and Rome. Holyrood is over in Edinburgh. The Grand Lodge of Scotland is not at this time even a thing, but this is a Jacobite lodge. We know that they had them in Spain. There were some multiple ones in Italy. And so kind of all over, they're setting up lodges with a royal decree or charter. And so they're doing that to bind these Masons to the Jacobite cause. Okay. Another guy that was on my picture a while ago with all the folks that were hanging out over at Saint Germain is this guy right here, Andrew Michael Ramsay. And we know him from Ramsay's oration. So what is this Ramsay's oration? Well, we'll get to talking about that in just a minute. But while he's hanging out here, Mar, the guy that had led the 1715, 1717 coups and invasions, and is kind of the mastermind of trying to do the spycraft and all the politics to form another invasion or another coup attempt. These guys are hanging out together at Saint Germain. They're on the same team. So they send King James III, who is the old pretender, who by this time is living in, he's not in Saint Germain, he's living in Rome, a proposal for a new military order of knighthood. A new military order of knighthood. This new chivalric order was Masonic in nature, and Mar served as its first Grand Master. You could say that this is a high degree. This is a creation of a higher degree. We don't really know what it was, but they do have a letter talking about this new order, military order of knighthood that they're going to form. They're going to do it with the blessing of King James the third. He's not really king. The old pretender wants to be king. 1723, Ramsay goes to Rome to become tutor to young Charles Edward Stuart. This is Bonnie Prince Charlie, the young pretender. Now he didn't stay there long. He didn't get along with the Catholic minders that were there, and so, but he was there for a while. So he knew him when he was a child. He was his tutor for a while. 1725, a couple years later, Mar and Ramsay establish a lodge at Paris. Founding members include Hector MacLean, O'Garaghty, Radcliffe, the 5th Earl of Derwentwater, which is the brother of the executed 3rd Earl that we talked about a while ago, the one that got captured in the 1715 rebellion. This will become important in a minute. Another guy that was hanging out in my picture a while ago is this guy, Philip, Duke of Wharton. Now, we know in 1723 that he's here receiving the charter of the Grand Lodge of England. He became Grand Master. And so he was kind of playing both ends against the middle. He was sometimes a king's man, sometimes a secret Jacobite. To what extent, when the frontispiece for Anderson's constitutions was drawn up, and he had just been elected in 1722 to take that Grand Mastership, which he did in 1723. To what extent was he a Jacobite at this point, or was he still a king's man? Or was he still on the fence? Well, we don't exactly know. We do know at his installation that he asked the band to play a song called "Let the King Enjoy His Own," which is a strictly Jacobite song. He apparently was drunk and singing it, and then he got reprimanded by a gentleman there that everybody tends to think was probably Desaguliers, but it was kind of an in-your-face Jacobite exhibition in the middle of what would have been normally an institution that had dedicated itself to the king, the Hanover. Wharton would be a fascinating program. I'm probably going to do a program on him next. He turns out later to be full Jacobite, all the way in with the Stuarts. Goes to the continent and has a long and sordid history. He apparently was mercurial, is one of the words that they use for him, and also a rake. It just means that he was crazy. He's a founding member of the Hellfire Club. Just apparently, he may have really had psychological issues. He was just very strange fellow. Anyway, different program. So I put this slide in just for context. This is going on during the rise of the Grand Lodge concept. So remember that prior to 1717, there was not a Grand Lodge in anywhere in the form that we know them today. Not where they had an office and paperwork and people that go out and DDGMs and DDGLs and ritual that was that was centralized, and it didn't work like that. Masonry was much more a collective of lodges without a central government, so to speak, Masonic government. So, but after they started the one in 1717, then slowly they began to pop up. Ireland in 1725, Scotland in 1736. France is really complicated, but maybe there's some references as early as 1728. Certainly by the 1730s, the Grand Orient is up and running, and they had multiple Grand Lodges running around. The Ancients come along in 1751. Interesting that this is a little bit later. However, we know that a lot of the Jacobite lodges, which existed both in the UK, what's the UK today, different parts of that, and on the continent, by 1751, this hope to restore the Stuarts, all of them is kind of faded out, because by this time Bonnie Prince Charlie is older, and a lot of those lodges went over to the Ancients. To what degree the Ancients were just the next evolution of those lodges, and to what degree they were just taken in some of those lodges, is debatable, but certainly there was a lot of cross-pollination there. Anyway, in addition to setting up lodges all over the continent of Europe and in parts of what's now the UK, for those reasons that we talked about earlier, to bind those guys to the idea of the Jacobite cause of restoring the Stuarts back to the throne of England, they're also, we know, creating these higher degrees that we talked about earlier. We talked about one of them, but it's going to turn out that there's a lot of these higher degrees, this whole concept of the higher degrees. In addition to just setting them up all around to support the Stuarts, they're kind of starting to export this, and they're starting to set up lodges that they know are going to kind of higher degrees that are going to travel to other countries. So we know that in September of 1737, Radcliffe, Derwentwater here, this guy, this is the third. This is the fifth. He hasn't. The third was the one that got executed in the 1715 debacle. But the fifth, Derwentwater, initiates Count Carl Frederick Scheffer, who is an important Swedish diplomat who in November received the Grand Master's warrant to establish Scottish lodges in Sweden. And so he does this. He goes back and he starts creating these Jacobite lodges in Sweden. And this is going to, we're going to come back to this story a little bit later, but this is kind of where it starts. And so you can see they're exporting Scottish Masonry to another country, to Sweden. Here's somebody with a tie, the Elu Cohen system. This gentleman right here at the top is Martinez de Pasquale. In 1763, now this is pretty far in advance of where we're talking right this minute, presents a patent dated 1738, which is the timeline we're on right now, allegedly issued by Bonnie Prince Charlie. It's disputed by some historians. They think that it was forged, which is possible. However, its authenticity at the time was accepted by the Grand Lodge of France, meaning that they thought it was both plausible that it was not a forgery, that it was real, and it was plausible that Bonnie Prince Charlie had actually signed it. Now, in 1738, Bonnie Prince Charlie was only 18 years old, and there's no proof ever that he was a Mason. We don't have, in the sense we think today, we don't have, a minute book where he was actually initiated. There's not a Grand Lodge database where you can pull up, that date he was initiated, passed, and raised. Didn't really work like that back then. Although there is a record book in existence that has a page torn out where some historians think that might have been where he was initiated, and those pages were ripped out for security measures, but that is somewhat speculation. Anyway, it was plausible enough an idea that both this patent was real and that he had signed it, that the Grand Lodge of France accepted it and then gave Pasquale the rights to start his own lodge and actually lodges. This actually had been given to his father with hereditary rights to his son, which is our Pasquale here. And that was kind of a thing back then. Pasquale claimed in this letter that he sent to the Grand Lodge of France, along with the patent, that the Scottish system of Christian Kabbalism was the only true Masonry and rooted in ancient tradition, going back to the idea that Scottish Masonry is more mystical, more Rosicrucian and Kabbalistic in nature. He went on to found multiple lodges, and eventually this all evolved into the Elu Cohen system mainly through this guy down here, which is Willermons. Another guy that kind of loosely ties in with this is Louis Claude de Saint-Martin, who was also a member of the Elu Cohens, eventually quit the Elu Cohens and went on to found a system called Martinism, which is not Masonic, but it kind of came out of this whole idea of the Elu Cohen system, which came out of this idea of this Scottish lodge, or this Scottish charter that was given by, allegedly, Bonnie Prince Charlie, which means that it's Jacobite in nature. So all of this can loosely be traced back to the concept of Jacobite Masonry. Whew. Okay, I think I'm doing okay on time, so I may slow down talking a little bit. I was really sprinting through this because I was afraid I would run out of time, but I think we're okay. Let me get a drink of water. Okay, another export of this Jacobite Scottish Masonry is this guy here. Baron Carl, can't pronounce that name, von Hund, was inducted into the Masonic Order of the Knights Templar by the masked Knight of the Red Feather. So this is pretty well documented, this Knight of the Red Feather degree that he got. He thought that it was Bonnie Prince Charlie, but most historians, including Bonnie Prince Charlie, when he was interviewed about it, said that he was not there at the time this happened in either Paris or Saint Germain. Again, Saint Germain's on the outskirts of Paris, but in one of those two lodges. They think it probably was the Radcliffe, who is the son of the fifth Earl Derwentwater, and as he and Bonnie Prince Charlie were often mistaken for each other. They said that these two kids looked very much alike, and they were often mistaken. But either way, Cavella, who is a historian, concludes that Hun's initiation was an affair of the young men with the blessing of their elders. Their elders would be all those guys that were hanging out at Saint Germain, who were starting up higher degree Jacobite lodges all over the place. So apparently the younger men, I'm not sure how young these kids would have been at the time, teenagers probably, had their own Jacobite degree, this Knight of the Red Feather. To what extent they were legitimate and tied to the others, we don't really know. But von Hund is going to go on to do great things that we're going to talk about in just a little bit. Founding of the Rite of Strict Observance, and we're not founding it, running it. Okay, the primary impetus for the rise of Freemasonry in the first quarter of the 18th century came from the Jacobites, but this decade also saw the infiltration of Masonic lodges, mainly English they're talking about here, by British intelligence. Freemasonry ceased to be a Jacobite secret society and seemed likely instead to become a Hanoverian fifth column. So certainly this indicates that certainly British intelligence knew that the Jacobites were setting up all these Masonic lodges to become Jacobite secret societies, right, with a Jacobite leaning, and that they could use for their own political purposes. So they were starting to infiltrate them, and they were not only trying to infiltrate them with spies, cowens, and eavesdroppers, right, but they were also at the same time kind of setting up their own lodges, which were Hanoverian in nature, especially in England, but they were trying to do this in places in Europe too, although they weren't near as welcome as the Jacobites were. Okay, so here's Charles Radcliffe, 5th Earl of Derwentwater. He is a world traveler. Every time I read about him, he's in some other country. Travels a lot, but for a while he was settled in at Rome, and he became friends with Bonnie Prince Charlie when they were both very young. In 1729, on one of his many trips to London, on this particular trip, he meets with both the Duke of Wharton, who we know is going to, become Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of England, that we saw in the frontispiece of Anderson's Constitutions, and with a guy named John Byrom. I only throw that in there because I have a quote from a book called the Byrom Collection. It's by a lady named Joy Hancock's, and it's a fabulous book, and it's he was a known Jacobite, and he shows in that book, if you're taking notes, be sure and get that, the Byrom Collection. I've got a bibliography at the end, and it talks a fair amount in that book about the Jacobite movement in England. So not only were they setting up all these lodges all over Europe, there were a lot of people in England that still believed in the Stuart Restoration, a lot, and that wanted to see that happen. So there were, but they couldn't be very open with it. So the political parties could be open about wanting to do it, but the people that were actually trying to plan, for some sort of either military invasion or some sort of coup or some sort of takeover, they had to be very secretive, of course. In 1736, he returns to Paris from Rome, where he's been with the old pretender, who's the current one that's trying to, in 1736, trying to be restored to the throne. Bonnie Prince Charlie is still a young man at this point, where he collaborated with Ramsay, this is back at Saint Germain, in order to transform the Scottish system into an order of chivalry, one which valued the older Christian Kabbalistic traditions of the Stuart fraternity. This is the new military order of knighthood that they had cooked up a few years later. But they're solidifying it now, and they're trying to specifically make it one of these higher degrees. And by binding guys into a military order of knighthood, they're binding them to the Stuart cause. So as part of this idea of this new Masonic military order of knighthood, a little bit later, the same year, December, we have Ramsay's oration. Whether he actually gave this in person or whether it was just circulated in print, the matter of some debate. Dr. Shuchard alleges that he gave it in person, probably did, and I don't really know. But it certainly became very powerful on paper and circulated all throughout Europe and the English lodges. Hints at Kabbalistic aspects of Masonry. Hints at, talks specifically about the Zerubbabel legend that all of the we see this in the Knight Masons and the York Rite and the Scottish Rite, this second temple aspect of Masonry that we see in the higher degrees. It hints at the restoration of the Stuart dynasty from multiple angles. It hints at the Templar connection. Doesn't mention the Templar specifically. Talks about the knights, but it doesn't talk, going to the Holy Land to fight and coming back. Doesn't specifically mention Templars, but everybody infers that. It was kind of the kickoff to this campaign to recruit these Masonic knights for the Jacobite cause that we just talked about. I threw this last thing in here just because it's interesting. They were opposed by John Custos, who was both a Hanoverian spy and set up an opposition lodge in France that were strictly Hanoverians. He eventually gets captured in Spain and is tortured by the Inquisition. And there's a fabulous account of that you can go. It's kind of a rabbit hole you can go down. But it was part of the the charge of the English system to try and counter what was going on with the Jacobites. Okay, so the day after the release of the oration, Ramsay's oration, Derwentwater was elected Grand Master, and both men began a concerted effort to recruit these new knights who would support the Stuart restoration. Now, here's a historical disclaimer for this slide for all of my academic friends. What I've got on here are quotes taken from various books, mostly Dr. Shuchard's work, that talks about connections to these systems. Some of them it's pretty well documented. Some of them it's more speculative. A lot of times, again, back then, Grand Lodge systems were just different, or lodge systems were different. You didn't necessarily have a paperwork trail the way that we do today. So some of these may be in the form of a letter from one guy to another guy talking about this particular degree that he saw or that he participated in. But in one form or another, all of these things that I'm fixing to mention have some tie back to Jacobite Masonry, the Royal Order of Heirdom, which became the Royal Order of Scotland. The Claremont system, the Royal Arch system, the Swedish Rite, the Rite of Strict Observance, in which would become the CBCS, the Elu Cohen system, as we discussed, the Rose Croix, and the Templar degrees, which we know were being worked in Holyrood during the invasion. So the rise of Bonnie Prince Charlie. At some point, James III, but prior to his death, just kind of got old and tired. He became very cautious after a lot of failed attempts. And I only mentioned the 1715 and 1717. I kind of have left out, in the essence of time, a ton of schemes that were trying to either do an invasion or a coup or some kind of a takeover and get him back on the throne. Most of this came not so much from the fact that all of his assistants in Europe were so in love with the Stuarts, Most of it was at various times. Most every country in Europe, it seems like, was at war with England at one time or another. They were always going to war and then making peace and then going back to war. Sometimes a bunch of them at one time. But they were using the Stuarts largely because they wanted to, because they were at war with England, and it seemed that while we're going to war with England, we'll just plop the Stuarts on the throne if we happen to win, and then the Stuarts will be very grateful to us, and they will be in our pocket to some degree. All that was going on. So anyway, at some point, after several, multiple more failed attempts, James III just kind of gets old and tired and says, hey, I'm going to turn this whole thing over to Charlie, because he was young and vivacious and ready to go to war and take back his crown. So in 1744, he invades Scotland. Now, he had really been promised an army, and there were going to be all these nation states were going to throw in with him, and they just kept dragging their feet and promising him an army, and it never arrived. And he was chomping at the bit. One of the quotes he had was that he was going to invade Scotland by himself in a canoe if that's what it took. So the key to getting back his crown to both Scotland and England was going to start in Scotland, and this was generally the way it worked. The Scottish were more likely to throw in with them, and then they could invade south. So in 1744, finally he invades literally with 7 guys. There was another ship, one got captured, just didn't work out. He literally washes up on shore with 7 guys, but everybody thought he was sunk, but he raised an army of Scots, and for a year and a half or so had his way in Scotland. And we know that in 1745 there's a letter from Duke of Perth to Lord Ogilvy that the Royal Arch and Templar degrees were being worked, and that Bonnie Prince Charlie was elected as the Grand Master. This was at Holyrood, and he basically is saying that they were working Royal Arch and Templar degrees there, and Bonnie Prince Charlie was there. He talks about being there and seeing Bonnie Prince Charlie being elected as Grand Master. The guy that was doing it resigned, and Bonnie Prince Charlie was put in that position. Is this letter authentic? It seems likely that it is. So even though we don't have a patent or a piece of paper showing that he was, the Grand Master, it seems that he was. All that was going great until April of 1746, when there was a great battle at Culloden, and this was the end of Bonnie Prince Charlie's invasion, and it really was to the decimation of Scotland. It's the reason that I'm sitting here talking to you right now. There was a great clearance of the Highlands of Scotland. Wallace is actually lowlanders, but everybody that supported the prince was essentially run out of their own country. Many of them were made indentured servants. They cleared the farms. The British came in very heavy-handedly. It was very difficult times for Scotland for a long time. Hence, a lot of them immigrated to Ireland and then on to America. And that's the reason that in North Carolina, so many people in the central part of North Carolina, most of them came in through like Pennsylvania, down through central Virginia, and settled in the Piedmont and Sandhill region of North Carolina. It's the reason that so many towns and counties and people in this part of the world have Scottish names. Not all of it coming specifically out of this battle, but it really began the diaspora of the Scottish people, and here I sit. Fate of the Jacobite Grand Masters that were involved in this particular invasion. I'm not, in the essence of time, I'm not going to go through all these, but you can see that most of them ended very poorly, including our friend Erskine, the 5th Earl of Derwentwater, who, just like his brother, was captured and decapitated. 2 brothers, 30 or so years apart in history, both paying the ultimate price. Both Masons, both supporting the Stuart cause. So the decline of the Jacobites. In the wake of Culloden, Jacobite Masonry began adding to lodge certificates the image of bees and beehives, the traditional symbols of the resurrection and rebuilding to signify the renewal of the Stuart cause. So they weren't broken, they were physically broken, but they weren't given up. Over the next decade, various French lodges claimed Charles Edward, Bonnie Prince Charlie, as their Grand Master, as opposed to his father, James III. And the Royal Order of Heredom and Kilwinning continued to secretly operate in England for a time. Final attempts. The British and the French signed a peace treaty, in one of the many, in 1748, and they asked Bonnie Prince Charlie to leave France. He travels kind of incognito all around the country, largely leaning on Jacobite lodges for logistical support. The last real attempt at an invasion was in 1759. The British are decisively defeat the French fleet, and that's really the last real attempt. By this time, Bonnie Prince Charlie is kind of getting old, and the whole thing just kind of just kind of flames out. So schism. So what do these lodges do when they lose their leader and their mission? They're Jacobite in nature. They were probably doing Masonic things in those lodges. But part of what they were doing was they were Jacobite in nature. So what happens when the Jacobite cause just kind of, peters out and, limps to a finish? Well, we don't really know, but the Heredom and Kilwinning Knights replaced Bonnie Prince Charlie. This is documented with the Duke of Cumberland, who is a avowed Hanoverian. This is not Butcher Cumberland, some of his people. The Clermont system Clermont was, the Duc de Clermont was the Grand Master of France for a long time. Interesting history there. We don't have time for it. I'm running out of time. The Elu Cohens kind of turned inward, became their own thing. Many of the Jacobite lodges went over to the Ancients. In 1785, Charles Edward issues a patent to the King of Sweden to take over, upon his death, the role of the head of Templar Masons. The king actually went to Rome and asked Bonnie Prince Charlie to let him become the head of the Templar Masons, and he did. So he gave him a patent that they would be co-regents until the death of Bonnie Prince Charlie. And when he died, the king actually took over, and the Swedish have a very robust system of Templar Masonry to this day. And that is Joe Wages and I know Art de Hoyos and some of the other folks are working in that, mining those fields, and they're finding out a ton of stuff. This is kind of where all this research has come from. A lot of the Grand Lodges in Europe, Swedes especially, we're finding out tons and tons of stuff that we didn't know, because their archives are being opened up to academic historians for research. So Bonnie Prince Charlie eventually dies in 1788. He's buried in Rome in different pieces. His body's one place. I think this is where his heart is. I think this is in the Vatican, if I remember right. And then it's done. The Stuart dynasty is done. The lodges, as we just discussed, are kind of going off and finding their own way. Some of them, no doubt, shut down. Some of them go over to other Grand Lodge systems. The Grand Lodge system has now become a thing. Some of the higher degrees kind of take on their own life. Some of them attach to other things. Here's a quick bibliography. I didn't do it in academic form, but this is, if you want some books on the subject, here they are. I'll leave this up for just a little bit. I seem to have about 10 minutes left. No, I'm not going to go into the Mauryan system, yeah, I'm not going to go into that right now, just for the essence of time. So anyway, there's a bibliography. I'll leave it up so anybody can copy any of those down. And Jeremy, I think I will, do you want me to take a few questions, or do you want to just, at this point, for me to limp off? Jeremy, I see a thing that says talking, but I can't hear you.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries.
No worries. Yeah, I am scouring the Facebook Live page. I've asked for anyone to, if they have any questions, I'll be more than happy to relay them to you. Just waiting to see if anyone does post. Ben, while we're waiting for that, I just want to thank you. That was unfortunately, working on the backside of this, I didn't get to hear all of it, but what I was able to pay attention to was fantastic. Thank you again for a fabulous presentation this morning.
You're welcome so much. Everybody's probably still in bed, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll be here a little later on. I can't believe I got it in 15 minutes. I probably should have slowed down a tick, but.
No, you had a great flow the entire time, so that it was again fantastic. There were a lot of comments just on what an amazing presentation you had. Some asked, there was a comment about what's the title of this, and one's response is how we ultimately won the revolution. All the seeds were planted here. So.
Well, they certainly lost their revolution. The Stuart dynasty did. So that wasn't good for them. Really, America was left largely out of this. Their focus was on Europe. They were trying to get back the throne of England and Scotland, and they just didn't have the time or energy to come here much. I'd be fascinated to know if there was a connection in America, but if there was, I really don't know what it is.
Well, not historical fact, but while we're talking, there is a show, Outlander, it's on, and it's funny. It coincides with the Jacobite Revolution, and then how a lot of and it follows characters that then come to America and are ultimately a part of the American Revolution as well. So again, not by no means factual, but definitely you can see the same seeds, the same sentiments that followed a lot of the Jacobite Revolution causes were a lot of the same pillars that ultimately were in the American Revolution as well.
Right. So most of the timeline that I was talking about was over and done. Most of the story I just told was over and done by the time we had our revolution. But there's no doubt that there were a ton of guys that came out of Scotland after the 1745 invasion attempt that ended in 46. And I talked about the Scottish people leaving and ending up ultimately in America. A lot of them would have been Masons. However, by that time, the Grand Lodge of Scotland had been founded, and no doubt in Scotland there were two types of lodges. There were strictly Scottish lodges that were working under the Grand Lodge of Scotland system, and there were these Jacobite lodges, because Scotland was not it's not that every man in Scotland was a Jacobite, right? They weren't all for King James being, any of the King James lineage, the Jacobite kids that were trying to get the throne back. Not everybody in Scotland was for that, even though they were hereditary Scottish kings. Some of them were king's men, Hanoverian, or if they weren't Hanoverian, they at least didn't want to have yet another revolution. They had a long history of being defeated by the English, and not every man was just hooray for king and country. Let's go get killed like my father and my grandfather did, fighting for this lost cause. So both of these lodges kind of existed in Scotland at the time, and as the clearings happened and they wound up in America, how many of those Masons from Scotland were Jacobite in nature, or how many would consider themselves just strictly under the Scottish system? I don't know the answer to that. Probably some of both. To what degree, I don't know, but certainly as they came to America, they were tired of getting their hind ends beat by the English. Hence the reason that a lot of, Jonathan probably can talk about this better than I can, the reason that the 71st Division down in Cumberland County and all, in the Fayetteville region, were sided with the English. They knew what happened when you fought the English. You got beat. So they sided with the English. In the American Revolution, many of them did. And they got beat, or, they got beat again. So, they were in a no-win situation. Anyway, I digress.
So I did have one question pop up so far. Besides peaceable citizen, are there any other aspects of Jacobite Masonry that we can still see in our modern ritual, ethos, or lore that you could expound on?
It's a very good question. I wish I had researched that a little bit better. Certainly, there was the mention in my program of the beehive. Really, the reason I put that quote in there was because of that. Whether that specifically is in there because of the Jacobite cause, is that a holdover from the Jacobite cause, or is the the bee is not just a Jacobite symbol? It's been the Merovingians used it. It's been been a symbol for probably as long as humans have been around. I don't know. I thought it was an interesting connection. It's possible. I, if my mind wasn't mush at this point by having just sprinted through all this, I might have a better answer for that. Whoever asked that question, you let me know who it was. Tell them I will do a little dredging through the ritual and see if I can come up with an answer to that.
You know him well. It's a worshipful brother, Don Barrier.
Oh, good. Well, I would tell Don this. Think, we have in our ritual an awful lot of obligations pertaining to secrecy. And so I think what we've pointed out here today is I've always been a believer that, certainly Freemasonry came out of the operative system, but then it kind of morphed into this more speculative system, right? But what the part that I didn't really get until later in my research career is that there was also a lot of politics floating around the Freemasonry as we know it today, speculative masonry, all this stuff that I'm talking about, both on the Hanoverian Whig side and on the Jacobite side. All of these lodges were places where today we don't talk about politics or religion. That's one certainly that could come back to our ritual. And the idea of this secrecy may not be so much about the esoteric aspect of our craft and just having your brother's back, but a lot of it may harken back to this concept of, you better not be talking about the wrong things in lodge because, there's spies everywhere. And, you could find yourself in big trouble and in jail and on the scaffold if you're talking the wrong thing. So when you're talking to your brothers about politics, shh, keep it sub rosa. I think I'm out of time, Jeremy.
I think we could probably go the rest of the day talking on this topic. I know it has been truly enlightening for me. And Brother Ben, the accolades on the live stream, great presentation, favorite Masonic speaker, just great presentation over and over again. Again, Wilkerson College Lodge appreciates your time this morning and your energies into your research. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Brother Ben, you're free to stay on the Zoom call, of course, if you want to get off. If you just jump onto the Facebook Live stream on the Refracted Light page throughout the day, please continue to participate and have a safe rest of your weekend.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, and thank Danny and the lodge officers for the opportunity.
Thank you. Brothers, we are going to pause the Facebook live stream in order to help separate the speakers as we plan to intend to load this onto YouTube later on so that anybody can come and see these presentations in their entirety if they come in late. I know we had some technical difficulties to begin the day, as were probably expected, and hopefully the worst is behind us. So if the stream will come back in about 3 minutes.